All right, well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the final lecture of not only the year, but of our fall season. We're really excited. Welcome to the Simons IMAX Theater. I'm Gina Parenti. I coordinate the lectures here at the aquarium. I also want to thank the Lowell Institute, which supports us and allows our programs to be free and open to the public. It is my honor tonight to actually pass the introduction job to Dr. Randy Rosen, Associate Research Scientist here at the aquarium. Thank you, Gina, and thank all of you for coming out tonight, especially in the cold. It is an honor and a pleasure to introduce a friend and collaborator of mine, Chrissy Hufford. Dr. Chrissy Hufford has studied cephalopods for over 15 years. Say that 10 times fast, it'll get you too. She's first started working on these animals at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and at the Smithsonian, where she worked with multiple different experts and giant squid enthusiasts to learn to describe new species. So she has a really strong taxonomic background. She then went on to UC Berkeley to do her PhD work, and then the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, or MBARI, for a postdoctoral fellowship, where she focused on reproduction and aggression in wild cephalopods. Over the years, Chrissy has published works on cephalopod behavioral ecology, biomechanics, evolution, taxonomy, and reproduction, based on both museum collections and her fieldwork, which is in really, really fantastic places such as Hawaii, Indonesia, the Line Islands, Guam, Australia, California, and Mexico. In addition to her work on cephalopods, she's also worked to support marine protected area monitoring programs in Indonesia and to study deep sea ecology along the U.S. West Coast. And actually, it was with her monitoring work in Indonesia where I first met Chrissy. She and I, and actually Alan Diner, who's here in the audience somewhere, were in a National Geographic, MBARI, New England Aquarium NCI joint expedition to look for seamounts out in Indonesia, which turned out to be ghost reefs. Reefs and ghost seamounts that fishermen have talked about and people have heard about, and Chrissy has seen. And the rest of us still haven't, and so these reefs still move around. And so it was really quite the adventure, and it's since been published in the National Geographic magazine. So there are lots of stories to tell from that boat, but what I'm really excited about most is the fact that I got to see an octopus with Chrissy underwater. And so with that, I'm going to let you have the same experience virtually tonight. Let's thank Chrissy so much for joining us from California this evening.
Thank you very much for coming. So I'm not used to speaking with a microphone. I'm used to projecting, so I'll try not to scream at you at the top of my voice. You can't hear me? Okay, well then I will project. So I study octopuses, and these are animals that a lot of people feel a connection to. And there are lots of stories surrounding these animals, and I hear lots of different versions of the stories and different opinions about their behavior and biology. And so I just wanted to talk tonight a little bit about some of the ideas that I hear from people or that I've learned in the field, and how much we really do or don't know about those ideas. And the first of which being this large killer octopus, but I'll get to that. Before I talk about anything, I don't want you to be distracted during my talk and spend the entire hour thinking, why is she saying octopuses? Why is she not saying octopi? And that's because it's a Greek root, not a Latin root. And so octopi is not the correct plural. Technically, the correct plural is octopodes. But most scientists use the term octopuses. And that's to refer to the shallow water octopuses that you see here. The reason we don't say octopodes is because that would just be too confusing, because there's a larger group, Octopoda, and that includes the octopods. So if we had octopods and octopodes, people would get confused all the time. So instead we have octopods and octopuses. Octopuses are the animals that I'll talk about tonight. So, grammar out of the way. What are octopuses? This is what I'll talk about tonight. What are some of the myths or behaviors or ideas that we have about them? Can they really do that? And if they can, how do they really do that? And some of the ideas that I'll talk about today: color change, mimicry, intelligence, and the great tank escape. And whenever possible, I'll draw from examples from the wild. I'll give examples from my own work and from the work of others to try to complete the picture as best I can. Now, octopuses are cephalopods, and cephalopods are mollusks. Mollusks are related to worms and other invertebrates. This in the upper right is an octopus. That one's called Wonderpus photogenicus. That's really its scientific name. Octopuses are related to the other cephalopods, the squid, the nautilus, the extinct ammonites and belemnites, and deep sea forms of octopods that have fins. So, such as this Grimpoteuthis, the cute little Dumbo octopus on the lower right. They have a closed circulatory system and blue blood, copper-based blood, and that's part of what makes them especially sensitive to chemicals. If you have an octopus in your home aquarium, heavy metals are really dangerous to octopuses because it interferes with the ability of their blood to hold oxygen. And their closed circulatory system has 3 hearts, which is pretty cool. They have very well-developed eyes, and their eyes have black and white vision and polarized vision. And so when they look at the reef, when we look at the reef, this is what we see. The octopus, I don't know how well you can see the pointer here, but it's in the middle of the frame. But to the reef, or to the octopus, that reef scene would look black and white. It's hard for me to show you exactly what polarized vision looks like, but if you picture wearing polarized sunglasses, Oakley's or other types of sunglasses that have glare-reducing capabilities, they're often filtering the sunlight from a certain direction so that it's not scattered. And cephalopods have this ability built into their eyes. And our eyes don't have that, but what we can do is fix a polarizer onto a camera that switches the plane of polarization or the direction of light coming in between each frame. So if you think of a video being shot at 30 or 60 frames per second, if something is changing between each frame, you'll see flashing, right? So, whoa. Hopefully this video, okay, so that tail of a mantis shrimp is flashing because that mantis shrimp has parts of its tail that are structurally reflecting light in a certain plane of polarization or a certain way. So it's reflecting light in different ways that we can't see, but the octopus's eyes have filters that allow it to see that. Cephalopods, and especially octopuses, are food for just about anything in the oceans that will eat anything else. They're really heavily preyed upon by sharks. They're the main prey for marine mammals, sharks, a lot of fishes. They have very strong incentive to get their defenses right, or there are pretty bad consequences. They have very large brains for invertebrates. So in blue, there's an outline of where the brain would be if you were to see through the octopus on the right, next to the eyes. The red is a segmented portion of the brain that processes the visual input. So the part of their brain that's dedicated to interpreting their vision is as big as the rest of their brain. So that's a lot of neurons dedicated just to taking in what you're seeing. And an interesting factoid about the octopus brain is that it actually surrounds their esophagus. So whatever they eat, it has to, once they swallow it, it has to go through their brain. So definitely portion size is an issue. So if you think, yeah, octopuses have really large brains, they must be really smart. So picture yourself having eyes each about half the size of your head, and a big portion of neurons and brain material behind those eyes just to process what you see and to take it in like that. Your brain's not really all that big, and it's around your esophagus. So it just puts it into perspective a little bit of how much brain material the octopus has working for it. But what they have that's something that really helps them live their lives pretty efficiently is that they also have a lot of mini brains or ganglia, a lot of nerve masses all along their arms. And that helps them process information and make very fast changes in their body without even having to go to the brain. So they can take in sensory information or information from their environment through their arms. That information makes it to a ganglion and makes the arm do something without the brain even having to process it. All right, so that was a little background about basic octopus biology. Myth number 1, do octopuses take down ships? This is an old illustration. It's not alone in its genre of large cephalopods taking down ships in the middle of the ocean. I've never seen a cephalopod take down a ship in the ocean, but there are very large cephalopods, not octopuses, but there are very large squids in the ocean that if they make it to the surface, they're usually out of their element. They're a very deep sea squid that get to grow very large. But the oxygen conditions, the oxygen environment in the deep sea, and the temperatures in the deep sea are very different from the temperatures and the oxygen at the surface of the ocean. And so whenever you take an animal out very far out of its natural environment, it can sometimes have a really hard time surviving. And so often what happens is when these deep sea squid come up to the surface, they just can't handle the temperatures and the oxygen levels at the surface, and they're very weak when they get to the surface. So even though there are large squids that size-wise, they probably could take down a ship, they probably wouldn't actually have the strength at the surface to do it. So I'm guessing that even though I don't have hard evidence to the contrary, this is probably a myth, which doesn't shock you, I'm sure. So color change. I'm giving the example here that probably many of you have seen. This is a video shot by Roger Hanlon, who is a researcher at Woods Hole. This is probably the single most famous cephalopod color change example. It's been viewed millions of times on the web, and many people who see this example wonder if it's real or not. And so I'll play it here. Hopefully. Oh. It was playing? Yes. Oh, sorry. It's not playing on my screen. Okay. So how many people have seen this? Yeah. So kudos to Roger for catching that on film. So that actually is true. That footage is not manipulated. That is a natural behavior that happens a lot on the reef. And cameras don't always catch it, but it's not entirely unusual to see an octopus change color that quickly. It's also not unusual to see an octopus that well camouflaged against the reef. And this is a picture of an octopus close up. You can see it's very well camouflaged. This is the same individual shortly thereafter. They can change in the blink of an eye. Now, how did they do that? What's the underlying mechanism? So this is a hatchling of the blue-ringed octopus that we video recorded in the lab. And see those little dots on its skin? Those are pigment sacs. So little sacs of color embedded in the skin. And each one of those sacs has nerves and muscles that control it. And when it expands, when each one expands, that pigment inside of it, the color inside of it spreads out and paints the skin. And then when those muscles contract, they spread it out. And then when they relax, it allows that pigment sac to go small again. They're elastic. And what you can see is there are different colors of pigment in there. And these pigment sacs, called chromatophores, are layered on the octopus skin over mirrored cells. So cells that actually reflect ambient light to give it its color. But that's just the color. So if you look very closely on, so if you can see the laser here, to the right here, this flap, that's a flap of skin. If you look very closely on that flap, you can see little darker dots. Those are individual chromatophores. And those are the cells that are responsible, or the organelles that are responsible for the color change in all cephalopods. But how do they make their skin bumpy? I mean, the skin changes just as quickly, the texture of the skin changes just as quickly as the color of the skin changes. So how do they do that? Well, that is also controlled by muscles and nerves. And each of those skin flaps is almost like a water balloon. If you picture a water balloon, you squeeze on one side and it expands in the other direction. There are muscles in each of those skin flaps that contract and make it stand up in one direction, and sometimes they're branched out. And then those muscles can relax and the skin lays flat. And all of this does happen very, very quickly. And it happens in a way that allows the animal to blend in with the reef pretty well. And it also is so effective that sometimes even when the habitat is just bare sand, there's not even really much to camouflage against. They can camouflage pretty well. But this ability is specific to each type of octopus. It wouldn't necessarily be possible for the octopus that you see on the screen here to camouflage onto that dark brown sand because it doesn't have those dark brown colors in its chromatophores or in its pigment sacs. And it wouldn't necessarily be able to camouflage into a reef. This particular species is very limited in the colors that it has in its body. And that gets back to one of the pretty interesting aspects of octopuses. Remember, they're colorblind. So how do they make themselves look the same color as their background? Anybody have a guess? Okay, so the key to that is in one of the first slides I showed when I showed the shark. Most of octopus predators can see color. And so over thousands and thousands and thousands of generations, the predators of octopuses have eaten the individuals that aren't very good at matching their background and don't have the particular color pattern that matches that particular habitat where that species lives. And so those that survive and reproduce and have more and more offspring are the ones that happen to have the color matches for their environment. But if you put an octopus into an environment that's not its home environment, there's a good chance it might not blend in very well because it can't just make any color that it happens to want. And also because it can't even see the colors that it's matching. If you put an octopus on a background of orange and blue, those are opposite colors that in black and white, if it's the same tones, they would look uniform. The animal would have a uniform color. It wouldn't necessarily know the difference between a very dark orange and a blue. So this camouflage works really well when octopuses are still. But at some point or another, you have to move. And when you move, that's when you're a lot more likely to be seen. And so what do you do when your whole life depends on not being seen? I mean, crypsis, or being camouflaged, that's their primary defense. That's the main way that octopuses avoid getting eaten. And if you're an octopus that lives on a habitat like this, you can duck into little holes or hide behind rocks and sneak into little nooks and crannies, and you can make your way around, and there's a lot to camouflage against. But some octopuses live on open sand, and when you move, you're picked up in a second. It's so easy to see you on the open sand. And so the mimic octopus, Thaumoctopus mimicus is its official name, the mimic octopus lives on open sand plains, and it has a different way of defending itself, and that's by mimicry. And it doesn't just mimic animals, any old animal. It mimics animals that are actually very easy to see and that are conspicuous. I thought this was a really interesting research question. If your entire ancestry has depended on not being seen for survival, how do you all of a sudden have a defense where your main way of survival is to say, hey, I'm not what you think I am? You know, that you have to know that's going to work the first time, or that's going to be a non-starter. And so how did the mimic octopus evolve? Does it really mimic? You know, what does it mimic, and how did it evolve that mimicry? And there's Roger Hanlon, who took the video of the camouflage octopus, did some preliminary work on the mimic octopuses and showed that they swim at the same swimming speed as flounder and the same burst duration, so they swim for just as long, same shape. So pretty solid evidence that it really is flounder mimicry that they're doing. And so then I was able to follow on from that and to see how they evolved. And it turns out that flounder mimicry evolved in stages. So I looked at the various body patternings of lots of different octopuses at rest and when they were disturbed, and compared that to a family tree and some other traits that octopuses have, such as how they swim, how long their arms are, and other things that would be related to how well you could swim like a flounder. And the mimic octopus and another octopus, Wonderpus photogenicus, that I showed you earlier, to our knowledge, those might be the only there may be 2 of 3 to 4 octopuses that have that very distinct high contrast color pattern at rest. And yet that high contrast color pattern actually, it evolved a long time ago in octopuses. They just only used it for when they were really defending themselves and really sending out a bluff or a startle display. And so the color pattern that the mimic has, it's not new. And the way of swimming is not new. There are actually other types of octopus that swim like that. But it's the mimic octopus that cobbled together these various ways of behaving and put it together as flounder mimicry that seems to be working. But that hasn't actually been tested in the wild. So far, I don't know of anybody that's actually gone out into the wild, seen a mimic octopus swim like a flounder, and have a predator avoid them. So what about other types of mimicry, and how flexible is this? So we know parts of this behavior are inherited, and mimic octopuses hatch out, and from a very young age, they swim like a flatfish even if they've been raised in an aquarium and have never seen a flounder. But is there learning involved? Does it allow them to mimic lots of other animals? Do they really mimic sea snakes and lionfish and these other animals? This is an octopus that we think might mimic a hermit crab, and I apologize, this video is a little bit shaky, but I was on snorkel and it was very surgy. So if it's too shaky for you, look down. And some people look at this and say, looks like a hermit crab. It only did this behavior in the afternoons. This species only does it in the afternoons when the hermit crabs are active. Or you could look at this and say, I don't see it. And so that's where the mimicry behavior work can be very subjective. You want to try to measure these things. Do they have similar shell shape as the types of hermit crabs that live in the area? Do they walk at the same speeds? And that hasn't been studied. But something that is very interesting about mimicry in another type of octopus is that some octopuses will actually mimic the fish that they happen to be around at the time. And they'll swim with them, and they'll display the same color patterns as those fish. Whether or not they've learned that, we don't know yet. Maybe somebody in this room can figure that out at some point. But mimicry is something that happens, and it's a pretty neat behavior. So another thing that mythical octopus cartoon characters that are based on octopuses in the cartoons and movies are often bipedal. And so when people see this video, I often hear, they're ready to take over the world now. But this is actually real footage that I shot. And there are several octopuses. Now this total count is 4 different species of octopus that can walk bipedally. And they do this. They're the only animals that we know of that are able to walk bipedally without the support of a rigid skeleton. Because when we think of bipedal animals, kind of what we think of, right? But it's not just us. There are others out there. And even a cockroach, when they're running, cockroaches will run bipedally. So all of these animals are examples of animals from all across the animal kingdom that do move with just 2 appendages, but they all have a skeleton. The cockroach happens to have an exoskeleton or an external shell that supports it, but they're all rigid. The way the octopus is able to do that is by, just like the water balloon example earlier with the skin flaps, the skin papillae, they have different bands of muscle that oppose against each other. So we have opposing muscles. This muscle relaxes, we tighten this muscle, our arm moves up, this muscle tightens, we relax this muscle, goes down. Octopuses have muscles going longitudinally, circularly, and in a helix, so in a twisted motion around their arm. And all of those muscles wrapped around each other allow it to squeeze really tightly against itself and maintain the constant body volume and inside itself. And so those opposing forces of just squeezing against itself really hard without changing its volume, that's what creates the forces that allow it to walk. All right, so are octopuses intelligent? This is a question that I get a lot. And first, before I can answer that, or before you can answer that, what is intelligence? Yeah, I'm picturing a Far Side cartoon where I think it's a dolphin that's done really miserably on a tree climbing test or something like that. And dolphins just getting assessed as stupid or something like that. And I think that example, which I'm sure I've mangled it, it's a good example of how animals are judged against each other based on the skills of each other. And so how can we really define what is intelligence? What makes an animal intelligent? Because we're used to the tests that we use for ourselves. But nonetheless, I've heard people mention the following traits when talking about octopus intelligence. They have really complex eyes and vision. They are so great at color change. They can walk. They can learn, they can remember, they have personality and tool use and play. But are all of these actual examples that we see out in the wild, or even how well supported are they in the aquaria? And do they require intelligence? So complex vision, exceptional color change, and bipedal walking all kind of fall in the same category. They're actually more like reflexes. They actually are either, we know for sure from some of the laboratory work or from the anatomy, that most of that is controlled in the color change, and the walking is more like a reflex. And the walking even probably happens without any brain control at all. So on the left, you can see an octopus reaching out from its den and whipping something. And these are pictures that are taken very quickly after each other, and you can see there's just a bend that moves along the arm and extends it. On the right, those are actually arms that aren't attached to a body. And there's an electrical impulse that's shooting through that arm, and it's doing the exact same thing. And so that movement, and this is the exact same movement that underlies bipedal locomotion, happens without the brain at all. All it is electrical stimulation. And those ganglia, those mini brains in the arms, are enough to control that. And so it doesn't really require intelligence in the way that we're used to thinking of. What about learning, memory, and personality? I think especially anybody who's kept an octopus in an aquarium will often mention that the animals really get to know you, and each animal that they've ever kept in the wild or in the aquarium has been different. Has anybody had that experience? Yeah. And that is actually backed up by research, that individual octopuses react differently to different situations, and those individuals have a consistent reaction. There's bold and there's shy octopuses, and there's research to back that up. They learn in the laboratory. They can perform if-then or conditional learning, so learn to make a decision based on the context. So an example of if-then conditioning and if-then learning in our lives is, if the crosswalk has an orange hand, you don't go. If the crosswalk has the lit up person walking, then you go. So that's contextual learning, and octopuses in the laboratory can do that. And their memory, depending on the species, seems to be a couple of weeks for long-term memory. Anything beyond that, they seem to forget. And people who keep octopuses in aquariums, home aquaria, often say that when they first get the animal home, for the first couple weeks, it demonstrates lots of different behaviors. And those are behaviors that might be relevant to what happened when they were in the wild. But then after a couple of weeks, they don't remember that they were ever in the wild. So they forget the behaviors that might have been learned in the wild and might have been relevant to those cases. And so here's an example of learning in the wild. So the animals that I studied for my dissertation, I studied mating and aggression mostly. And one important part of that system was that big males defended big females from small males. And males very rarely tried to mate with each other. They tried to mate with the female. And the females had a given hole, a given den, and the small males would try to approach those females. So this is a video of a very small male making the wrong decision and having a learning moment. So he's approaching the den. He's making an if-then decision. He puts one arm in. Oh, there's an octopus in there. There's another octopus in there. Okay, great. Then I put my mating arm in there. They never reached with the mating arm first. But that's not the female. That's the big male that was guarding the big female. And so the small male swims off. And examples like this happened all the time. And what we were able to show in that system was that the males in that system tended to learn how likely they were to win a fight based on how big they were. Size almost always determined who was the winner. The big octopus always chased away the small octopus. And size also determined which males even bothered to try to guard females. And it happened to be that only when the males were, depending on the other males that were around, because it was different in different sites, only when each male was big enough to win about half of its fights would it even bother trying to go for the female, trying to guard the female. And so they're learning how well they can, how good their chances are of actually getting a mate. They're learning in the wild, and then they're behaving accordingly. And some of them were especially aggressive and some not. All right, tool use. This is a new one that came out a few years ago by Julian Finn and colleagues in Australia. Showed a picture of an octopus, and there are lots of examples. You know, it's not an isolated case. This is a very common behavior in Indonesia of octopuses carrying coconut shells. This particular species of octopus carrying coconut shells underneath them. And they call this tool use under the there are many definitions of tool use. The definition that they used was that it was a tool because it was going to be used for a later use. And they were carrying around shells, not because those shells were useful then, but because they would use them later. And that's according to some definitions of tool use, a very important factor. It's that timing of thinking about an object and knowing that it will be useful later and expending the energy to deal with it until you can actually use it later. So, is this tool use? Does it fit that definition? So, on the other hand, you could say, well, isn't that what a hermit crab does? Right? Carries around its shell that it's borrowed from something else. But a hermit crab uses that shell all the time. And so it's a matter of timing. It's also a matter of which type of tool use you consider, how you interpret that. So this is the environment where that octopus lives. You can see these little banded shrimp in the front. And if you look closely in the back, you see those two beady eyes sticking out of the sand? Those are a mantis shrimp. That mantis shrimp is about this long. And that mantis shrimp hunts by lunging out of the sand about this high. It's called a mantis shrimp because it has big spears that it thrusts out of the sand and it impales its prey. And they're pretty well camouflaged. They have a big trampoline of sand around their entrance, and that trampoline of sand is very thin so that they can burst through it and catch their prey. But normally, all you see are these tiny little eyes. And so, this is maybe just a personal preference, but if I lived in that habitat, and at any given moment, an enormous set of spears could lunge out of the sand from underneath me, I would want to maybe carry something under me that would protect me from that. And this is another example of a predator in that habitat that lives in the sand. This is a stargazer. I've brushed the sand away from it so that you can actually see this fish. But it lies flat in the sand. It covers itself up completely except for its mouth. And if something walks over it, it opens up its mouth so fast that water rushes in, and anything that was in that water, such as an octopus, would rush into its mouth. And so the environment where this octopus lives has most of the predators that it actually has to defend itself from are actually living in the sand. And they're lie-in-wait predators that are not moving, and they're very hard to see. And so this is an example that I don't think is fully fleshed out yet. So this remains a mystery in my mind, whether or not this is true tool use, or if these animals are using those shells all the time for defense the way a hermit crab would use a shell. All right, play. Do octopuses play? This is a picture actually from the New England Aquarium website. And I think it's a fantastic picture because it shows the animal really, the giant Pacific octopus, really manipulating what we perceive to be a toy in a way that it's not going to get any food out of it. It doesn't have any immediate use. This animal, according to the website and some information, some stories, held on to this object for days or a full day. Why? There's no use for it. So this, according to many definitions of play, that would be play. The scientific literature has approached this with one study, this concept with one study, that the sample size is very low, and so, as scientists, we rely on statistics, and so it's hard to say from a mathematical standpoint how common this behavior might be. But this is another one where it's really interesting to see how people will study this in the future. It's an intriguing example of something where scientists have a lot to learn from people who keep octopuses in aquaria to see how those animals get used to objects, used to environments, and those scientists can then take those ideas and start testing them. But as of yet, this is just barely tested by some researchers in Canada. All right. So for the past 15, 16 years, I've heard about 1,000 different versions of, now stop me if you've heard this before. So my friend had this aquarium, and he had two aquaria. One had an octopus, and the other one had fish or crabs or shrimp or snails or mussels. And the fish or shrimp or crabs or snails or mussels started going missing, and they set up a video camera in the middle of the night and realized that the octopus was crawling out of its tank and going over to the other tank, eating, and then going back to its tank. And, I have to say I've heard so many versions of this story that I seem very skeptical. And also, from my time studying various species of octopuses in the field and keeping them in the aquarium, they're hungry and they're not dumb, and they go through a lot of energy to catch food. So if you're going to go through all of that energy to go across the room and you land yourself in a whole tank full of food, why would you ever leave? And so that, that was my skepticism. But I put it out there to people who I know who are a much better expert in this field than I am. The community of online called Tonmo, which is an online blog about octopuses. So tonmo.com. It's a great resource if you're interested in octopuses in general. And I asked, okay, have you guys seen this? Where does this come from? I'm skeptical, but, I haven't had as much experience in this as you. So the answers that I got back, I learned that the first reference to this behavior was from the 1800s, where somebody actually described in detail an octopus crawling out of one tank, going into another one, and catching food and coming back. And there's one person in the forum who sees this repeatedly, and even better, which this makes the story even better, the animal would do it at a certain time, which was always when the keepers weren't in there, and the keepers came in every night at 10:30. So they would always make sure that in their 6 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. window, they'd go over, steal the food, and come back. And they've seen this a number of times, and they've actually caught the octopus in the act. And so, as skeptical as I was, where is this video? There's always a video camera set up in the middle of the night, but nobody ever has the video. But there are examples of this. And I think it has a lot to do with how close the tanks are to each other. But, there you go. Anecdotal evidence that I feel is pretty solid. So, thank you very much for coming tonight, and I hope that some of your questions about octopuses were answered, and I hope that you also walk out with some questions that keep you interested in following what these animals do and maybe even studying them one day. So, thank you. Yes, in the back.
You didn't tell a story about the octopus that opens the jar.
Oh, okay, so I'll tell the story about the octopus that opens the jar and gets the crab out of the jar. And there are various aquaria. The New England Aquarium, I'm not sure if you do this, the Seattle Aquarium, the Monterey Bay Aquarium, teach their octopuses to open a jar and get food out from the jar. And sometimes it seems pretty amazing how the animal's able to actually unscrew the jar or go through this very elaborate puzzle to get the food out. But this requires a lot of training. And they start training by just barely putting the lid onto the jar. And so the animal doesn't really unscrew it so much as just nudge it. And then they gradually tighten that lid so that the animal gradually learns how to untwist that lid. So there's a bit of training involved in that. It's also very similar to the way that octopuses get their food naturally in the wild. In the wild, many types of octopus actually eat clams, and so they either pry them open or, if they're small enough, will crush them. Sometimes they drill holes and inject venom to kill the clam if they're really large clams. But it's that idea of manipulating their prey and just wrangling the prey to eventually get to the meat inside is actually a pretty natural behavior. And I think getting the food out of the jar is an extension of that. Yeah. Yes?
Question. I've always thought this right. And so therefore, I've always been amazed that fishermen that specialize in catching octopus are so productive. How do they catch so many?
So the question is, how do fishermen catch so many octopuses, given that they're so smart? And I'm wondering if an extension of that is why haven't octopuses figured out how not to be caught? So many of the octopus fisheries that I know of take advantage of two very important behaviors to octopuses. One is hiding. So they put out octopus pots, and the octopuses go into the pot as if it's a den. It's a ready-made den. Or they actually swim up to the octopus dens and pull them out of their dens if they're doing it by freediving. But another very popular way of catching octopuses in the South Pacific is to drag a rock with something trailing behind it through the seagrass or across the reef. And that looks enough like another octopus that they'll grab onto it. And sometimes there's a hook in there that catches them and they bring it up. And so that ties into their natural tendencies to want to mate or be aggressive to any other octopus that they see. So they're smart, but not quite smart enough. Yes, you?
Why were they catching the octopus?
The question is, why were they catching the octopuses? In many parts of the world, people eat octopus, including here. In the black shirt? Yeah.
Yes, I was just wondering, you mentioned that the octopuses are very vulnerable to heavy metals.
Yeah.
What are the big environmental threats to them?
The question is, given that octopuses are sensitive to heavy metals, what are the big environmental threats to octopuses? Heavy metal pollution, I don't know specifically if studies have been done on mercury pollution, but I'm guessing that would be a big threat to them. But really, probably the largest threat would be habitat loss and water quality. There was an example in Florida of a harmful algae bloom, so like a red tide, killing off all the octopuses in a small bay. I was diving once in Indonesia, and we found this site that was amazing for cephalopods. I mean, there were cuttlefishes everywhere, and we're so excited to find this incredibly beautiful site. And the rains came, and it was so rainy that we ended up just moving the boat and diving somewhere else, but we loved that site so much we went back the next day. 24 hours later, there was so much runoff from logging in the nearby forest that an inch of sediment and mud had settled onto that area. We didn't see much of anything. So there's some very quick habitat destruction that can happen, and it's not necessarily something that's focused on the reefs. It's something, things that we do on land have a big impact on their environment. Yes?
So, do octopuses usually eat meat? Are they carnivores, or are there exceptions to that?
Great question. The question was, do octopuses eat meat, or are they carnivores? And the question is, they're almost all octopuses are carnivores in that they kill live prey for their food. There's one distant relative of the octopus called the Vampiroteuthis, or the vampire squid, that actually eats marine snow. And so I'm not sure if it collects animals that are also very small animals like amphipods that might be living in the marine snow. But it looks like that might be the only predator, or the only cephalopod that's not a direct predator. Actually, correct myself, the nautilus will scavenge. Sometimes nautilus will eat dead animals on the seafloor. Yeah. Yes? Question is, if they have brains along their arms, what does the main brain do? So the ganglia, or the distributed nervous system, is for reflexes, some parts of locomotion, and some parts of skin control. But the brain is very heavily involved in learning and memory and general interpretation of the situation. Yeah, but it's mostly learning and memory and taking in everything and putting it together and synthesizing the way we do our brains. But they have some brain parts that, we have a certain brain part where language is focused and a certain brain part where we think. They have that too, but it's a lot more diffuse. So a certain, their memory might have some control in this part of the brain, some control in that part of the brain, some control in that part of the brain. It's kind of all over the place. Yes?
In the five-tailed octopus, do they use any of the tentacles that they have? And those tentacles specifically adapted to do that? Or do they evolve into any specific organs or something that help them do that?
Yeah, so the question was, do any of the arms get used for bipedal locomotion, or is it two specific arms? And there are two specific arms. They use the back, in all the cases that we've seen, they use the back two arms. And in the species that we've seen this in, those have always been the strongest, most robust muscular arms on those animals. And some octopuses have much stronger front arms, but the way they move, I don't think that bipedal locomotion would really get them anywhere, because then they'd maybe be tripping over themselves and stumbling. But it is the back two arms so far of the examples that we've seen. And I don't think there's any special adaptations so much as the fact that those are the strongest arms. But there's some researchers in Ruth Bird, she was in Pennsylvania, I forget where she is now, in Europe somewhere, who found that many octopuses use a specific arm for a specific task. And the back arms tend to be used for locomotion, and the front arms tend to be used for exploration. Yes? In the back, and then you in the shirt. Okay.
Do you know what the evolutionary process was that started bipedal locomotion? Like how that benefits their survival?
So the question is, how does bipedal locomotion benefit the octopus's survival? And actually, I'm glad you asked that question, because I meant to say it during my talk. So when an octopus moves, it gives itself away, right? So if you live on an open habitat and you have to move really quickly, you're going to get seen, unless you're a mimic octopus where your defense is to be seen and just perceived as something else. But the bipedal locomotion actually allows them to move very quickly while maintaining some level of camouflage. So I'll go back to the video, if I can here. So when I measured the speeds of swimming and crawling and jetting and bipedal locomotion. And bipedal locomotion was almost as fast as swimming. So it's a form of fast escape. But to look at that, if you were a predator, you wouldn't necessarily think octopus. You know, that's my guess. I'm anthropomorphizing a lot there. But that doesn't fit the typical search image of an octopus for that area. That animal lives in a place with lots of clumps of algae floating around, and so that would blend in with the environment. So it allows them to escape, even if they can escape very quickly and maybe not give themselves away with their identity. Their other forms of fast escape look very much like what we think of as an octopus. They don't have many skin flaps. There's not much drag, They're very streamlined, and a predator would very easily see what they were. And then you in the t-shirt in front of Ruth.
Are any species specifically endangered for fishing or recreational use?
The question is, are any species in danger because of overfishing or recreational use? We don't know. If I were to, well, Octopus vulgaris in the Mediterranean has very strong fisheries regulations now because the populations had been fished so low. And I think that fishery might have even been, if not stopped for a while, then very heavy regulated to reduce the catches because those populations had been so low. Wonderpus photogenicus is caught for the aquarium trade. They produce a very small number of young, and those young are actually planktonic. So if you think of the ways marine animals have young, two of the general life history options are either have lots of very small young and most of them die, or you have a few larger young and you have a much better chance of some of them surviving. Well, Wonderpus produces only a few very small young. So there's the possibility that that one could be at risk, and also because of habitat destruction. It lives on open sediment, sand plains, not really as charismatic as coral reefs, not a lot of people out there protecting them. So in the parts of the world where Wonderpus lives, many coastal sand plain areas are being reclaimed, and more land is being put out, airports and hotels being built over that sand. So that could put them at risk. Yeah. Yes?
How good are octopus's arms at manipulating their environments?
The question was, how good are octopus's arms at manipulating their environments? Pretty good. They're really strong. And so they can build a den and create a den that has the features that they'll maintain over, depends on the species, sometimes, more than a month. And they can bring in some pretty big rocks. But another really neat way that some octopuses can use their environment, it's not necessarily manipulating in the traditional sense, but they're using a type of the environment in a way you don't think of. The mimic octopus. So when I first started my research, the mimic octopus didn't have a scientific name. It wasn't described, and that was because there were no really good specimens. Every time a new species is described, you need a voucher for that species so that 150 years from now, if somebody thinks they saw that same species, they can go to a museum and say, okay, this is what so-and-so meant when they described that species. They can hold it in their hands, and that's a voucher. But the mimic was described in pictures and video, but people didn't have specimens that were deposited in museums. So I got permits to collect 2 individuals, one to keep in the US and one to keep in Indonesia for the species description. And the first one, I had seen them before, but when I watch them, I normally don't chase them. I like to leave them on the reef or on the sand plains. But this one, I saw and I went to catch it, and it dived under the sand. And I thought, okay, I'll do my standard, my MO. I wait, and I wait, and I wait, and I wait, thinking it'll come back up. And it came up a meter away. The mimic octopus and several other octopuses that live in the sand can actually swim under the sand and pop up. There's no den, no burrow system. They swim under the sand, and they use their arms to do that. So if anybody is a biomechanics or a functional morphologist student, and I would love for somebody to have a clear sand or a way of videotaping them in doing that and study the biology of that. That would be fantastic. Yes?
Do chromatophores support a specific range of colors, or can the octopus adapt to a different color range and just change their color?
The question was, do chromatophores support a specific range of colors, or is that adaptable? And they have a very specific range of color. Each chromatophore has one particular color that it can produce, or that it can show. And you see this layering of colors because there are many different chromatophores of different colors. Almost like a newspaper is made up of all the little dots, and you can perceive, or a magazine picture is made up of those dots, but each dot is only a single color. Yeah. Yes?
Do octopuses have extensive social behavior, or is it primarily limited to mating interactions?
The question is, do octopuses have extensive social behavior, or is it limited to mating? And as far as we know, it's limited to mating. And communication seems to be limited to, I'm male, or I'm going to fight you. That's pretty much it. Yes, and the black jacket there.
Can you talk about the range of lifespans? I hear a lot of different things, but I know they last a lot less longer than I thought they did.
Yeah, so the question was, how long do they live, and what's the range of lifespans out there? It depends. Small tropical species, some of them live 6 months to a year, full life cycle. Some of the cold water species live years. And it's possible that some of the very cold water deep sea animals could live decades, but we don't really have solid evidence for that.
4 or 5 years?
4 to 5 years for the giant Pacific octopus that might be your standard display animal. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Is the world octopus like pretty World Cup winners?
Yeah. So what about the octopus that predicted the World Cup winners? That's a great question. Paul the octopus. I got asked about Paul the octopus a lot. People in Indonesia were really wanting to know that. So I didn't look at the range of choices that Paul the octopus had for each of those matches, but I was talking about this with another cephalopod biologist, and they had looked at that range of choices, and he said that in each case, the octopus chose the higher contrast flag. So when octopuses are mating and fighting, if we go back to this video, that black and white stripe display is very common, not just across octopuses, but across cephalopods. Very dark colors next to very white colors have strong import to cephalopods, whether it's through defense or mating. And so they might have a reason to approach something of higher contrast and choose that choice. So maybe that's what was going on with Paul the octopus, the World Cup phenom. Yes? So the question is, how do octopuses hunt and what do they eat? Most octopuses hunt by feeling around on the reef and feeling their arms into little holes, digging in the sand. But they also sometimes do visually hunt. If they see something crawl by that is something that they would find appetizing, they would go swim over to it or crawl over to it and catch it. What they eat depends on the type of octopus. A lot of them eat crustaceans, so crabs, mantis shrimps. Those are pretty commonly eaten. Some of them eat snails and bivalves, so clams. Some of them eat fishes. I was in the field once and I was doing a prey study and looking at the different prey that the day reef octopus was bringing back, and I would catch them while they were foraging in case they were eating things that they didn't bring back to their den, and taking pictures of it and then identifying the prey from the photographs. There was this one type of fish I just couldn't identify, and I showed it to my friend who was a goby expert, and he looked at it and he said, "Oh, that's a new species. That's the only specimen we would have ever had That one. The octopus got it, so they do eat fish too, but it's not in the record. It's not commonly in the records because a lot of people have studied octopus prey in the past by looking at what middens or what remains of the prey are left at the dens, and fish don't leave a lot of remains there. Yes?
The suction cups on the arms of the octopus, does the octopus have control over them?
So the question is, do octopuses have control over the suction cups of the arms? And yes, they do. They have, inside each suction cup is a little ball. And when that ball pulls up, it creates a vacuum in the water space, that little hole in the sucker. If you can picture a sucker, I wish I had a good picture. But there's a little hole in the sucker, and when you pull that up, it creates a vacuum that causes suction in there. And then when they want to release the suction, they release those muscles, and that little ball falls back down, and there's not as much of a vacuum or a suction inside that system. But yeah, it's under their control. Yes?
Back to the lifespans, are there any specific qualities that the octopus could have to live longer, like the ones that live longer?
So the question is, of the ones that live longer, are there any special qualities that they have? I don't think so. I think a lot of it is related to temperature and how much they eat and how fast their bodies grow. In marine animals in general, a lot of colder water animals do live longer. There are a few types of octopus that actually do have a longer than average lifespan given their temperature range because they actually mate more than once in their life, so they don't die after egg laying. But those are very rare. Yes? The question is the mating arm normally longer than the other arms? And in that particular type of octopus, the mating arm is just slightly longer than it would be if it, compared to the other arm on the other side. But in many types of octopus, the mating arm is actually much shorter. And if you're ever snorkeling and you're trying to decide if you're looking at a male or a female, if it's a male, it'll usually have that mating arm curled up right next to it. Because you can imagine in a situation like that, the longer that arm is, the better the chance it'll get eaten or something will happen to it. And so even when they're very long, they keep them curled up and protected next to the body. Yes?
So I've heard that some octopuses have a favorite object and it looks like to hold on to it. Is that true?
The question is, you've heard that some octopuses have a favorite object and might fight to hold on to it. I haven't seen that in my own experience, but it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case in a home aquarium. Yes, in the way back.
You mentioned mimicry as far as avoiding becoming prey, but I've seen other cephalopods use that in mating, where they will mimic the other gender,
Mm-hmm.
like male cuttlefish
Yes.
impersonating females.
Yeah. There is evidence. So I found the question is there evidence of mimicry of males mimicking females in octopuses during mating? And yeah, I was able to show that in this type of octopus. And interestingly, whenever the sneaker males mated with the female was always in her den, so wasn't able to choose against him. And so they weren't just imitating, they weren't just being cryptic to hide from the guarding males that were right there and would have beat them up. They were also being cryptic from the females too, and so physically avoiding the females. So it's a very interesting example. They also were always the smallest males in that region for any given size range of all the octopuses around. Yes?
Are there any octopuses in Massachusetts and what are they?
Yeah. So the question is, are there any octopuses in Massachusetts and what are they? I have to say I've been focusing on the Pacific octopuses. There are lots of octopuses on the U.S. East Coast, but I don't know how many of them come up to Massachusetts. I know there's Octopus burrii, a small one, but I don't know, is there anybody here who works at the aquarium who could answer that? Oh, Bathypolypus, is that? Yeah, Bathypolypus arcticus, is that? Yeah, so yeah, it's a very small deep water octopus. Thank you. Okay, yes?
Do many octopuses have like bioluminescence in the deep sea floor?
So the question is, do octopuses in the deep sea have bioluminescence? And there are relatives of the octopus that do, but nothing that has this general form does. But there are close relatives of octopuses that do have bioluminescence in the deep sea. Yeah. Yes?
Is there a size of octopus that makes it safe from predators? If they grow this big, then basically the natural predators are not dangerous anymore to them?
The question is there a size of octopus that allows them to be safe from predators? If they grow to a certain size, will they be guaranteed to be safe? There's a predator for every octopus out there. Yeah, even the giant Pacific octopus, which actually will eat small sharks. That's a YouTube sensation, which is actually true. That's one of my favorite videos out there. But even that octopus would be eaten by a sea lion or a shark. Yeah. Okay, 2 more questions. Yes. The question is, have there been other examples of tool use other than the coconut shield? Not that I know of. Yeah. And yeah. What are the main components of octopus ink? Melanin, so skin pigments, and various, there are some people who have looked into it. There are various chemicals that might be just wastes, metabolic byproducts, but wastes. But yeah, there are other chemicals in there. I think there might be chemicals that would dull your senses. So they're chemical irritants. But interestingly, ink also, so there's very little known about ink use in the wild. Of all the time that I've spent watching octopus, I've seen octopuses ink against predators maybe 3 times, 4 times ever. I've seen them ink against other octopuses maybe 6 times. So there's potential. I've seen cuttlefish use ink as part of communications displays. And ink is actually dangerous to an octopus if an octopus was in a confined space with its own ink. So if your octopus inks in its home aquarium, change out water. It'll kill it. But the only study that I know of when somebody's actually tested, done a controlled experiment to test the chemicals, the effect of the chemicals on a predator, predators were attracted to ink. So there you go. Yeah, great.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.